Hi, Ashley here with HeartHookHome.com, and today we are going to work up a gauge swatch and adjust our hook size for the gauge recommended in a pattern. So I'm actually going to be working up a square with you, and then we will measure it and decide if we need to go up a hook size or down a hook size to meet the gauge as required. So a few things to note about gauge swatches. Gauge swatches are particularly useful when crocheting wearables like cardigans or any type of thing that has a specific measurement that you need to meet. For something like blankets or scarves, it's really not that important that you check gauge, but when it gets into wearables where a designer says you need to have 15.5 inches across the back of your cardigan, then you really do need to make sure that your stitches are the same size as the designer's. Otherwise, yours is going to either come out way smaller or way larger than the intended size. So checking gauge is always extremely important when you're crocheting something that is going to be worn or that needs to be a specific size. Gauge swatches themselves, you're typically going to be measuring 4 inches by 4 inches. And if you're wondering, this is not 4 inches, this is slightly larger than that. And you do want it to be like 5 inches, maybe even 6 inches, so that you're not counting your outside stitches here. Sometimes your outside stitches can be a lot thinner than your inside stitches, and depending on what stitch you're using. When you're measuring, you want to make sure that you're only measuring inside stitches. So always shoot for about 5 to 6. 6 inches square is really going to be the money spot. So when you are doing a gauge swatch, if there is not a gauge pattern listed in the actual pattern itself, then you're going to use the stitch that makes up the body of the pattern. So if you are creating a poncho like I just published, the On Point poncho, and it has double crochet stitches throughout the entire pattern, then your gauge swatch, you're going to use double crochet to check your gauge on it as well. So right now I'm going to be using Burnout Super Value. This is a new to me yarn. I'm pretty excited to get to use it. We're going to be using this with the eye hook to work up a gauge swatch. So if there is not a gauge pattern listed in your pattern itself, just go ahead and start chaining. You're going to just chain until you get at least 6 inches of width, right? Because we want it to be about 6 so that when we measure, we're not measuring those outside stitches. You only want to measure the inside stitches. And it doesn't really matter how many you chain, because since this is a gauge swatch, if you don't end up working your way all the way back through to the beginning stitches or chains over here, it's okay. You're just going to rip it out anyway. You're only doing this to check the size of your hook compared to the size of my hook, right? Or a designer's hook. Doesn't have to be me. Any crochet pattern. Okay, so this looks like I've got a decent amount of chains here. It's at least 4 inches and probably at least 6, maybe even 8 inches. So since I'm using double crochet in this pattern, supposedly, we are going to do a double crochet stitch for our gauge pattern. So for me, and it doesn't really matter if you do 2 and go into the 3rd or if you go into the 4th, it doesn't really matter because you're not going to be counting those edge stitches anyway. So just go ahead and start a double crochet swatch. And so when I say swatch, we're just going to do double crochets all the way down to the end of the row. Okay, I think this is probably good enough. Now, if you have some chains over here, if you're doing your own gauge swatch, you might end up with some chains left over. It's really okay. It's not a big deal. Like I said, you're just going to end up ripping it out anyway. I'm going to do one more just to satisfy I don't know what. So now we're going to just continue crocheting more rows of double crochet until we have a square, right? And then we're going to measure that square. So chain 2, turn, double crochet in that first, and in each stitch across, continue adding double crochet rows just like we are here until you get it at least 5 or 6 inches tall. So here I am finishing up the last row of my gauge swatch, and then we are going to measure to count our stitches in those 4 inches and our rows as well in 4 inches. So when I'm done, one more stitch. Perfect. All right. So we are going to measure how many stitches we have and how many rows we have in 4 inches. Here we have my handy dandy little tape measurer, right? I'm going to line up, well, let's zoom in. I'm going to line up the left side here with the outside of that stitch. And remember, I'm not counting any of these outside stitches. I want all of my measuring to be done within the square, so not including any outside stitches. So it looks like I have, get my pointer, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 stitches, because this last stitch is right here is where this ends, right? So we've got 12 stitches wide. So if your pattern that you're following says that you should only have 10, right, like we talked about, you're going to want to make sure that your stitches are a little bit bigger, because if I have 12 here and I'm only supposed to have 10, then my stitches here are too small. So I need to go up a hook size to make my stitches slightly larger, and then I'm going to remeasure and see if it comes out at 10 instead. Now, one thing that you can also try to change is if you have an eye hook that's a particular brand, this is the Clover Soft Touch, in a 5.5 millimeter. If you have a different brand hook that's the same size, sometimes the shaft here will be shaped a little bit differently. Sometimes they're tapered, sometimes they're inline, depending on if it's a wood hook, like a bamboo hook, or an aluminum hook like this. It can change even with the same millimeter hook size. It can change the style or the composition of your stitches just enough to where if you're really close to the designer's measurement, but you're not quite there and you don't really want to go up that full hook size, maybe try a different brand, because that can really make a difference. So now I'm going to measure the height of my rows. And again, we're going to be measuring within the square. You do not want to start way at the bottom, really. You want to measure within the square. So here I'm lining this up with the bottom of this row. So this is a row right here. I'm lining up my tape measure right there. So now I'm going to count my rows. And I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it looks like about 6.5. This right here, let me lay my needle, that's where row 7 is. So it looks like 4 is going to be right at 6.5, in between here and here. So you've got 12 stitches wide and 6.5 rows tall. So if you need to adjust that based on the pattern that you're following, you would either go up a hook size or down a hook size to obtain the gauge. So just remember that if your stitches are too small, if you have too many stitches, they're too small in your 4 inches, you need to make those stitches a little bit bigger. So you're going to go up a hook size. If you don't have enough stitches, say you have let's say you have 10 and you need 12, then you're going to need to go down a hook size to make those stitches slightly smaller so that you can fit more of them in that same 4 inches. Does that make sense? I hope it does. I hope this helps you with your gauging issues. Like I said earlier, it's not really important when you're making blankets or scarves or anything that doesn't need to be a specific size, but when you're making cardigans, jackets, sweaters, tops, anything like that, gauge is super important, because yours will not turn out the same as the designer intended if your stitches themselves are not the same size as the designers. So if you have any questions with gauge, be sure to let me know. Of course, I look forward to creating more video tutorials for everyone, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks for watching.